We know quite a lot about demand so far, about buyers. So let's focus on sellers now. The other side of the market, occupied by sellers, will be called market supply. We could obviously define market supply in many ways, but I decided to choose the definition that is pretty similar to the definition of market demand. Have a look. Supply is what sellers want and can supply, not buy, but supply at a given price over a given period of time. So we've got a lot of analogies here. We've got, again, 4 elements that are kind of highlighted. What is supplied depends on what sellers want to supply, because we cannot force them, and what they are able to supply, because they have their own limitations, and they supply at a given price, and this price is important to them, just like it is important for us buyers, but obviously from the other perspective. And supply can only be discussed when we think of a certain period of time. So how much you produce now, how much you supply now, is a kind of pointless question. You cannot answer it, actually. I can only say how much I'm supplying over 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. This is my production, weekly, monthly, right? This is my sales, daily, quarterly. So this reference to the period of time is important. Market supply obviously depends, as this definition suggests, it depends on market price. But there are also other factors. They are mostly connected with the costs of production. And when we proceed later on to the theory of cost, you will see that actually supply has a lot to do with one of the costs. Market supply depends also on profitability of other goods production. So for instance, if you produce chairs and your business is not that great, but you learn from your friend that producing tables is much more profitable, then this information, high profitability of table production, may influence market supply of chairs, because you may switch from producing chairs to producing tables. After all, they all have 4 legs, so that's not that complicated. If you can make a chair in your company, you can produce tables probably as well. There are also some natural factors that would have a great influence on market supply. That could be, for instance, climate conditions, right? They are very important for agriculture. We cannot control climate. So this is the factor that actually influence market supply of food worldwide to a great extent. And there are other less important factors here as well. Can we see the graphical representation of market supply? Obviously, like here. You can see in this graph here that market supply uses the same set of axes, like the vertical axis of P and the horizontal axis of Q, quantity. This time, this is not quantity demanded as it was, this is quantity supplied, and market price is here on the vertical line. If you look at the curve of supply, you can see that it is substantially different from market demand and demand curve. Demand curve was downward sloping, showing that consumers don't like high prices. Here, for the supply, it's a different story, because producers actually never mind high prices. They actually like them. Therefore, the slope of this curve is positive. The bigger are prices, the greater are quantities that are supplied. So you can see here, when the price goes up, quantity supplied goes up as well. Again, quantity supplied. There is a difference between changes in quantity supplied and changes in market supply. So change in supply and change in quantity supplied, there are two different things, and this is pretty much analogical to what we already said in the previous part about demand, right? So when you look at this graph here, what you see is change in quantity supplied. The pattern described by the curve stays the same. You get different prices, you get different quantities supplied. But if something changes, some major change in climate, for instance, like late frosts, okay, and some of the crops are destroyed, that would shift the whole curve of supply to the left, showing the change in supply, the decrease in supply in case of late frosts that destroy crops. So this is what market supply looks like in the graphical sense. In the next part, we are going to combine the picture of demand and picture of supply. We are going to put them together and see what happens. After we have discussed the problem of market demand and market supply, we know more or less about the behavior and the factors that influence the behavior of buyers and sellers. Let's have a look at the complete picture of the market. So here it is, as you can see in the slide. We've got those two curves that we already discussed put together. We've got the market demand here and market supply over here, right? And there is a point of intersection between them. Since one of them is upward sloping, the other one is downward sloping, they are pretty likely, or actually they are pretty sure, to get an intersection. This intersection point is called market equilibrium. What is funny about market equilibrium? If you have some buyers and their buying patterns that are described with this D curve, and if you have some sellers on the other side, and their supplying behaviors are described with this S curve in this graph, then in the real life we will notice a funny thing. Those two groups of entities, those people that are connected to each other through the market mechanism, they would negotiate the quantity and the price of goods they are trading, and quite naturally they would converge towards quantity demanded that is equal to quantity supplied. So they would converge to this point of intersection. So we could say, in other words, that if we have buyers and sellers, they would have this natural tendency to achieve market equilibrium. Why is that, or why should we expect market to produce this market equilibrium? So let's imagine what happens if there is no market equilibrium in the market. Let's start with the first situation, this first situation being a shortage. What happens if we have market shortage? Market shortage appears in the market when the price is smaller, is lower than the value of equilibrium price. You can see equilibrium price here that corresponds with this intersection point, and shortage appears when the price is, as you can see, smaller than equilibrium price. That price results in two things. First of all, this low price does not encourage producers, suppliers, to supply a lot to the market. Actually, only those most efficient with the lowest costs can supply to this market. So you can see this quantity supply that is pretty small. On the other hand, this very low price is very attractive to buyers. You can see buyers want to buy a lot. Quantity demanded here is very high. So there is a difference between what is supplied to the market and what is demanded from the market. The funny thing here is, regardless of the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, the quantity traded, sold, and bought is the same. I mean, you cannot buy without selling, you cannot sell without buying. So quantity actually traded will always be the smaller one. So if the quantity supplied is small, quantity demanded is big, then quantity traded, the quantity that tells you how many transactions were made in the market, would be the smaller number. In this case, quantity supplied. That would mean that many consumers would see they don't get their product because there was not enough product in the market. So actually, if they want to get this product, they will show to the suppliers that they could pay more because they want this product. They want to have this product. Suppliers, they see that they can sell easily, and there are many people who didn't get their product. That would encourage them to increase prices. If we start increasing prices in this market, then we start gliding along the curves, up and to the left in case of demand, up and to the right in case the supply curve. Going up with the price, we will see that the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded starts to be smaller and smaller and smaller. This difference will disappear in the point of intersection, which is market equilibrium. So if the price is too low, there will be a natural pressure from the market participants, both sellers and surprisingly buyers as well, to push the price up. To push the price up to the level of market equilibrium. When the price is too high, and this is this blue situation here with surplus, when the price is too high, then we've got market surplus here. So the quantity demanded is pretty small because people, buyers, consumers, get discouraged by this high price. And on the other hand, sellers, producers, they produce, they supply to the market quite a lot of goods because they find it attractive. This price, this high price is attractive to them. So you can see quantity demanded is smaller, quantity supplied is greater. What is quantity traded? Remember, always the smaller one. So the quantity traded would be quantity demanded, in fact. And quite a lot of products will stay in the market and no one would buy those products. So this is this market surplus here, right? That means producers would have the pressure to lower the price to get rid of these products, right? And consumers will see there is a lot of products in the market. So actually consumers would also push on lower prices because they don't want to pay that much for the product that is everywhere, right? Therefore, there is pressure on lowering the price, and those two quantities, quantity supplied and quantity demanded, become to be closer and closer to each other. And at the end, this market surplus will disappear and market equilibrium will be restored. So this is how we get market equilibrium here. In the market equilibrium, we could say everyone who wants to sell and accepts this equilibrium price will be able to sell. Everyone who wants to buy and accepts the equilibrium price will be able to buy. So we could say both sides, buyers and sellers, are kind of satisfied kind of satisfied in this point. Because if they wanted to buy, they were able to buy. If they wanted to sell, they were able to sell. I said they are kind of happy, kind of satisfied. Because obviously, all sellers would really like prices to be higher. Obviously, all the buyers would really like prices to be lower than equilibrium price. But actually, when the price is different from the equilibrium price, it creates surplus, it creates shortage, meaning it creates a situation when you want to buy, but you cannot, or you want to sell and you cannot. In equilibrium, everyone who wants to buy is able to buy. Everyone who wants to sell is able to sell. On one big condition, they accept the market price, the equilibrium market price. Is it possible sometimes that this market equilibrium will not be attained for a longer time or permanent? Actually, it is. This tendency, this ability of market mechanism to achieve, to restore market equilibrium is connected with one quality of the market: freedom. In free market, without any intervention from the outside, an external intervention, market will always set itself in the equilibrium point. But sometimes the government decides to make an intervention, to change something. As we already said, markets are not perfect, and sometimes they may be imperfect to that extent that the government decides to make an intervention. What kind of intervention? Well, this is intervention in prices. So the government may decide that prices will not be freely decided upon by demand and supply, but they will be decided by the government. Like, for instance, in agriculture. In many countries, it is believed that farmers are not only kind of business owners, producers, like the producer of chairs or cars or computers. As producers, they are kind of specific for two reasons. First of all, food is very important. So you can live without your computer, even though it seems to be very difficult nowadays, but you can't live without food. The other aspect is that farmers and their production is very sensitive to weather conditions. And weather conditions is something we cannot control, they cannot control, therefore they assume additional risk. Not only the normal risk that any market participant must assume, not only the normal risks that are associated with any production. Agricultural production has more risk associated with because of, for instance, the climate, right? Therefore, the government says, all right, we will compensate this risk by setting the system of prices, the so-called minimum prices. They are called, in economic theory, they are called price floors. We say, all right, this is the minimum price at which this particular good can be traded. So it is kind of illegal to buy and sell below that price. So if this kind of market intervention is made, then we see this price floor that is calculated above the price of equilibrium. And since it is above, it creates surplus. Okay? It creates market surplus, and market mechanism that is normally employed to restore the equilibrium cannot be used here, because this market mechanism would be about pushing the price back to the level of PE, the price of equilibrium, right? But that is not possible, that is not legal, right? So that would be the situation when on one hand farmers can enjoy nice high prices, higher than the equilibrium price, but then some of them will not be able to sell to the market because people don't want to buy that much. At this high price, they will buy a little bit. So part is sold and part is left in the market as a surplus, right? So that was, for instance, a few decades ago, that was one of the major problems of the European Union. Overproduction in agriculture because of this kind of prices, right? This kind of price system. And there was overproduction and it was very difficult to do, all right, what will we do with all this wine that is produced and milk and butter, and the governments had to make another kind of intervention, like they buy all those goods, they try to export it to other countries. That was pretty complicated. But nevertheless, price floors are used in quite a few industries, and agriculture is usually perceived as one of those. You can see it very, very clearly. Another situation would be with price ceilings. That would be kind of maximum prices that create market shortage, like in the graph here. And usually those price ceilings are can be found in apartment rental markets, for instance. In many countries, governments decide to make intervention in those markets. They do not allow people like buyers and sellers in the flat rental market to set the prices in a free way, but they say, well, apartments are very important for people. They can't be too expensive, because if they are too expensive, people cannot afford them, and everyone has to live somewhere. Therefore, we will keep prices low. Like here in this graph, you can see this price is much lower than the price of equilibrium, right? On one hand, that means cheap flats. The rent is not high. So on one hand, many people, like quantity demanded here, many people want to rent a flat to live, but on the other hand, there is just a limited number of people. Look at QS, quantity supplied here. There are not many people who are willing to give their flats for this little money. So we've got a shortage, right? So we've got a shortage, and this is a kind of long-term effect that is created by price ceilings. There are other negative sides to this situation. It's not only the shortage. I mean that prices are low, so you could rent a flat, but there are no flats available. But because of those low prices, that means also that owners are not very much motivated to take care of the flats they rent out. So the quality, not only the quantity, but also the quality of those flats is pretty low. They do not have incentives to be competitive in the market because they know there is shortage in this market, right? So this is kind of the effect that price ceilings create. This is always questionable to what extent we should allow market to operate freely and to what extent we should introduce this kind of price controls like price floors and price ceilings, but this is probably for you to discuss on forum and during seminars. There's a lot of aspects to be considered here. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. That's all for today.